The lounge went silent. Every eye locked on one man, Malcolm Carter, standing still as stone in his navy blue suit. Across from him, the manager's cold smile had just curdled into panic, because at that very second, the doors of the Aerolux Sky Lounge burst open and in walked a trembling vice president of the airline. His voice cracked like glass. "You're fired. All of you. Pack your desks. Now." The room gasped. Luggage wheels froze. Coffee cups stopped midair. The hum of whispered deals collapsed into dead silence. But here's the part no one expected. He wasn't talking to Malcolm. He was looking past him, straight at the very staff who had just humiliated him minutes earlier. And then came the twist. Instead of turning toward Malcolm with respect, Peterson, the powerful executive, the man in charge of all North American operations, looked at him with fear. Not politeness, not apology. Fear. The kind of fear that makes your throat close up. The kind of fear that says, this man doesn't just fly first class. He controls the ground you're standing on. So let me ask you, how could one racist dismissal inside an airport lounge trigger the downfall of an entire management team? And what kind of quiet power makes a vice president of an airline look like he's seen a ghost? The truth didn't start with Peterson storming in. It started 5 minutes earlier, when Malcolm walked into that polished sanctuary of money and status, expecting nothing more than a seat and silence. But the thing about elite spaces is this. They're built on discretion. Everyone knows the rules. No drama, no noise. Image is everything. Which is why what happened next wasn't just humiliating. It was explosive. Malcolm had just arrived from Los Angeles, tired but focused, carrying a slim black briefcase. He wasn't trying to be noticed. He wanted a quiet corner, away from the noise of Terminal 4. A place to gather his thoughts before a meeting in London that could reshape his company's future. On the surface, he looked like any other high-powered traveler. Confident, polished, calm. But appearances cut both ways. Because to the woman standing at the counter, Linda, the lounge manager, his appearance said something else. She didn't see the long hours, the discipline, the brilliance behind his sharp eyes. She didn't even see his first-class boarding pass. She saw a black man in a space she thought he didn't belong. And with a smile so thin it could slice glass, she decided to test him. "Can I help you?" she asked, but her tone wasn't helpful. It was the kind of question that really means, "Are you lost?" That's when the first crack appeared in the marble-perfect surface of this elite space. Because lounges like Aerolux don't run on kindness. They run on hierarchy, on the unspoken rules of who belongs and who doesn't. And Linda decided, in front of dozens of watching eyes, that Malcolm didn't. The humiliation hit fast and hard. One moment, he was a respected executive stepping into a sanctuary of power. The next, he was being told, loudly and firmly, to step outside. A public dismissal in a place designed for privacy. You could feel the sting in the air, people whispering, some smirking, others shifting uncomfortably in their leather seats. But Malcolm didn't fight. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply paused, breathed, and reached for his phone. 5 words typed. Sent. That's all. And while Linda smirked, thinking she'd won her little battle, the room didn't realize what had just been set in motion. Because 5 minutes later, the world inside that lounge would flip upside down. Careers destroyed. Secrets exposed. And one calm black man would walk away without saying a single word. It was 5 simple words that took less than 3 seconds to type, but 5 minutes to detonate. 5 words powerful enough to end careers, terrify a vice president, and shatter the foundation of a billion-dollar airline. The question isn't just who he texted. The real question is, what did he write? Malcolm Carter wasn't the kind of man who needed to prove himself. His presence did it for him. The navy blue suit, pressed so sharp it could cut glass, wasn't about fashion. It was about discipline. The quiet confidence in his walk wasn't arrogance. It was the muscle memory of a man who had worked twice as hard for half the recognition and refused to let bitterness slow him down. He was a CEO, yes, but that word hardly explained him. People think CEO and picture boardrooms, golf courses, and champagne. But Malcolm was built different. He rose not by handshakes passed down from old money, but by grit. Long nights, missed birthdays, flights at dawn. Every step forward came at a cost, and every deal he closed carried the weight of proving that he belonged in spaces designed to keep him out. Still, he never bragged. He never raised his voice just to fill the air. Silence was his language. In meetings, he could hold a room with a glance. In airports, he blended in until he chose not to, and when he did speak, his words landed like stones dropped in still water, small at first, but echoing wider than anyone expected. But here's what people didn't know. His success story, the one others admired from afar, wasn't what it seemed. On paper, he was the polished executive, the man companies begged to partner with, the man publications called self-made. And all of that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Beneath the tailored suits and the smooth press releases lay a hidden life, one so carefully buried that not even his closest competitors had an inkling. That's the part that made him dangerous. Because when people underestimated him, when they saw only skin and not strategy, they revealed themselves. They handed him their weaknesses without even realizing it. And he never forgot a single one. So when Linda smirked at him in the Aero Lux Sky Lounge, assuming she had the upper hand, she wasn't facing just another passenger. She was facing a man who had built his career on patience, silence, and precision. A man who knew how to wait until the right moment to strike. And that's why her mistake would cost more than she could imagine. But before we get to that explosive downfall, you need to understand something else, the place where it all happened. Because Terminal 4 at JFK isn't just an airport. It's a stage. And what played out, there was no accident. JFK's Terminal 4 isn't just an airport terminal. It's a stage where money walks loud, but speaks in whispers. The marble floors shine like mirrors, polished, so clean you can see the stress lines on your own face as you hurry past. Digital screens glow with names of cities, London, Dubai, Zurich, destinations of power. The air smells faintly of espresso and leather, a mix of indulgence and exhaustion. Every corner carries the hush of wealth. And inside this palace of travel sits the Aero Lux Sky Lounge, a place so exclusive it feels less like part of an airport and more like a private club. Frosted glass walls, plush seats where executives recline with laptops open, deals unfolding over champagne instead of conference calls. A world built on discretion. In here, voices stay low, phones stay private, and mistakes are never supposed to happen. This was not a place for second chances. Not a place where anyone questioned who you were, unless they already believed you didn't belong. The rules of the lounge weren't written down, but they were enforced by every glance, every raised brow, every pause of silence when someone walked in who didn't fit. And on this day, the stage was perfectly set. Malcolm Carter walked in with quiet confidence, navy suit pressed, briefcase in hand, his boarding pass guaranteeing him entry. He wasn't there to impress anyone. He simply wanted a chair, a table, and 30 minutes of peace before heading to London for the meeting that could redefine his company. But here's the ugly truth about elite spaces. Wealth doesn't erase suspicion when skin color enters the conversation. Other passengers noticed him right away. Not with words, but with quick, subtle glances. The kind you felt before when people scan you, not out of curiosity, but out of quiet judgment. One man shifted in his leather chair, lowering his newspaper just enough to study Malcolm's stride. A woman sipping rose paused, her eyes narrowing like she had a question she'd never dare to say out loud. The lounge itself seemed to hold its breath, as if testing whether he truly belonged. Because in these spaces, acceptance isn't about your ticket or your title. It's about whether the gatekeepers, both official and unofficial, decide you've earned your place. And that gatekeeper was waiting for him at the counter. Behind the polished desk stood Linda, the lounge manager, lips pressed into a smile that looked professional but felt cold. She watched him approach with eyes that said more than her words ever could. She had already decided something about him, long before he reached her. And here's where everything turns. Because in a place designed for silence and discretion, the sharp edge of her voice would soon cut through the air like broken glass. What she said next would not only humiliate Malcolm in front of everyone watching, It would trigger a chain of events that none of them were ready for. Linda stood at the counter like a guard at a gate that wasn't hers to own. Her blazer was pressed, her name tag gleamed, but her smile was ice. The kind of smile that pretends to be professional while every muscle in the face screams, "You don't belong here." When Malcolm approached, she didn't greet him like the others. For the businessman before him, she had leaned forward, soft voice, polite nod. But for Malcolm, her eyes narrowed, her chin tilted, her tone sharpened. "Can I help you?" she asked, but the words carried something extra. A question wrapped in doubt, dipped in dismissal. He placed his boarding pass on the counter, steady, without hesitation. "First class," printed in bold. But Linda didn't even look down. Her eyes stayed on him, scanning, measuring, judging. Seconds stretched. Her silence was louder than the clinking glasses in the lounge behind her. And then came the little details, the microaggressions that cut deep without ever being spoken plain. The wrinkle of her nose, like something about him didn't fit. The pause before every word, like she was deciding how little respect she could get away with showing. The half glance to the other staff, who exchanged the smallest of smirks, the kind meant to signal silent agreement. Passengers nearby noticed too. A man in a gray suit lowered his newspaper, pretending to read while his eyes locked on the scene. A woman scrolling her phone slowed her gestures, curiosity pulling her into the moment. They weren't going to intervene, but they were watching. Witnesses always. That's how humiliation works best. Quietly public, undeniable, but never loud enough to be called out without risk. Linda leaned forward now, voice still low but sharpened like glass. "Are you sure you're in the right place, sir?" The question wasn't about his ticket. It was about him. His suit, his skin, his presence inside a lounge designed for people who looked different from him. Malcolm didn't flinch. His posture stayed calm, his face unreadable, his silence steady. But inside, the sting was there. Because in that single line, Linda had drawn a line in the marble floor. She was telling him, "Your money, your status, your ticket, none of it erases what I've already decided about you." And that's when she raised her voice, not for him, but for everyone else to hear. The mask slipped, the performance sharpened, and her cold smile widened. What came next would turn a private insult into a public spectacle. She could have lowered her voice. She could have checked the ticket in his hand. She could have handled it with discretion, the very word the airline preached in all its glossy brochures. But she didn't. Linda lifted her chin and let her voice carry across the marble lobby, sharp and cold enough for everyone to hear. "You'll have to wait outside." The words echoed louder than the rolling suitcase wheels and the soft clink of champagne glasses. For a split second, the whole lounge seemed to pause. Heads turned. A few passengers pretended not to notice, burying themselves in their phones. Others leaned in, curious, eager for drama to spice up their layover. And then there were those smirks, tiny, satisfied grins, as if Linda had just confirmed what they already believed, that a man like Malcolm didn't belong in a space like this. Malcolm held out his first-class ticket, calm, steady, undeniable proof that he had every right to be there. But Linda never glanced at it. She didn't want facts. She wanted a scene. She wanted to mark the line between who belonged and who didn't. The sting wasn't just in her words. It was in her refusal to even look. And so, in full view of strangers, Malcolm Carter, CEO, first-class passenger, dressed in a Taylor Navy suit, was told he didn't measure up. The humiliation hit with precision, like it had been rehearsed. His success, his money, his status, none of it shielded him from suspicion. In that moment, he wasn't a respected executive. He was a target, reduced to a problem to be pushed out the door. Passengers whispered. One woman in pearls leaned closer to her husband, whispering behind her hand. A businessman shook his head slowly, as if to say what a shame. A young couple by the espresso bar looked away quickly, guilt flickering across their faces. And still, Linda stood there, satisfied, her smile frozen and performative. She had won the exchange, at least that's what she thought. But humiliation has layers. It wasn't just the embarrassment of being told to leave. It was the spectacle, the performance of it all. Linda wanted him small, and she wanted the room to watch him shrink. That's what made it sting. Not the word alone, but the stage she chose. A lounge full of strangers now carried the memory of him being dismissed. Malcolm didn't move right away. He stood still, his hand holding the ticket steady, his face unreadable. Inside, the cut was real, sharp, undeniable. But his silence was louder than her command. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain who he was or why he was there. He simply let the moment hang in the air, making everyone else just a little more uncomfortable. Linda mistook his silence for defeat. She crossed her arms and tilted her head, waiting for him to step back. When he finally did, she let out a breathy laugh, almost theatrical, as if she had restored order to her kingdom. What she didn't know was that every second of her arrogance was tightening the noose around her own career. For Malcolm, the humiliation wasn't the end. It was the trigger, because when dignity is stolen in public, the response has to be just as visible, but not in the way Linda expected. And as Malcolm slipped his phone from his pocket, the question wasn't whether he would respond. It was how. He lowered his gaze to the glowing screen, typed just 5 words, and pressed send. Linda smirked, convinced he was begging customer service for help. But what he had actually triggered would shatter everything in the lounge within minutes. Malcolm had every reason to raise his voice, every reason to demand the manager's name, to call security, to push back against the insult that had just played out in public. But he didn't. Instead, he stood in the middle of the Aero Lux Sky Lounge with the weight of a dozen eyes pressing down on him, and he chose silence. The silence wasn't weakness. It was discipline. It was power disguised as stillness. While Linda expected outrage, expected him to stumble into the trap of being labeled aggressive, Malcolm denied her the show she was hoping for. He let her bask in her smirk, let her believe she'd won. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket. The move was deliberate, almost casual, but it carried a weight that nobody in the room understood. He pulled out his phone, unlocked it with a quick swipe, and began typing. Just 5 words. No more, no less. To everyone else, it looked ordinary. A man texting about his inconvenience. Nothing dramatic. No anger. Just a quiet complaint, the kind of thing that gets lost in some call center queue. Linda folded her arms and leaned slightly to the side, her grin widening. To her, this was the perfect ending, a difficult passenger pushed out, reduced to begging customer service for an answer that would never come. But that's the thing about arrogance. It blinds people. It makes them underestimate the very moment that will undo them. Linda didn't see the precision in his fingers. She didn't notice the subtle calm in his breathing. She thought he was small when, in reality, he was holding the kind of power she couldn't imagine. Malcolm hit send. The phone buzzed once in his hand, then went still. No calls, no long explanations, no drama. Just silence again. The room seemed to reset itself. Passengers went back to their magazines, their coffee cups, their whispered conversations. But every now and then, someone glanced back at him, curious about why he wasn't arguing. Why wasn't he fighting to stay inside the lounge he had paid for? Because Malcolm knew better. He knew this wasn't the stage for a shouting match. This was the stage for something much bigger. And while Linda leaned on the counter, humming under her breath, pleased with her little victory, the clock above the bar ticked forward. 5 minutes. That was all it would take. 5 minutes before the silence shattered and the room realized he hadn't texted customer service at all. The clock above the bar ticked once, a soft metallic click that cut through the low murmur of voices. 1 minute had passed since Malcolm Carter pressed send on that 5-word text. To everyone else, it looked like nothing at all. But silence is never empty. Sometimes it's the loudest sound in the room. He stood by the window, posture straight, phone back in his pocket, eyes calm. No shouting, no pleading, just waiting. And that waiting did something strange to the room. It pulled the air tight, like everyone inside could feel a shift but couldn't name it. 2 minutes. A man in a tailored suit peeked over his newspaper, pretending to read the markets while his eyes lingered on Malcolm. Across the lounge, a couple with champagne glasses stopped whispering and started watching him more openly. There was something about the way he carried himself, like he wasn't worried at all, that confused them. They expected him to leave in shame. Instead, he stood there as if he owned the silence. The staff noticed too. Linda leaned against the counter, arms folded, her cold smile still stretched wide. To her, this was victory. She had kept the line clean, the space exclusive, as they like to say. One of her colleagues whispered something, and they both chuckled softly, glancing at Malcolm like he was the punchline. Their laughter was quick, but it landed heavy, a reminder that humiliation doesn't always need volume. It just needs witnesses. 3 minutes. The clock ticked again. A businessman adjusted his tie and shifted uncomfortably. He couldn't stop replaying Linda's voice in his head. "You'll have to wait outside." The words hadn't been directed at him, but they left a sour taste all the same. Some passengers pretended to look at their phones, but their eyes betrayed them. They were watching the black man in the Navy suit, waiting to see what he would do next. For minutes, the silence turned heavy, almost unbearable. Malcolm didn't move. He didn't fidget. He didn't check his phone. His calmness was its own kind of defiance, sharper than any argument he could have thrown back. It was as if he knew something the rest of the room didn't. And maybe that's what unsettled him most. Because silence, when carried with confidence, starts to feel like power. 5 minutes. The moment stretched thin, fragile as glass. Linda tapped her pen against the counter, impatience flickering across her face. Why hadn't he left yet? Why wasn't he embarrassed enough to walk away? To her, the waiting was pointless. To him, the waiting was everything. The clock ticked once more. The air shifted. A low, mechanical hum filled the doorway as the frosted glass doors of the lounge slid open. Heads turned. For an instant, everyone expected a security guard, maybe even a police officer, to escort Malcolm out. But what walked in made Linda's smirk vanish before she could hide it. The clock struck the 5th minute, and the lounge doors slid open with a hiss. Every head turned, expecting a security guard to escort Malcolm out in shame. But what walked in wasn't a guard. It wasn't even a low-level supervisor. It was Peterson, the airline's vice president of North American operations. He didn't glide in with corporate polish. He stumbled. His tie was crooked, his face pale, and a sheen of sweat clung to his forehead. He looked like a man summoned from a nightmare, rushing into the daylight. And here's the detail that made the entire room freeze. He didn't look at Malcolm. Not once. His eyes locked straight onto Linda behind the counter, and his expression was the kind of fear that makes your stomach drop. He didn't ask questions. He didn't request explanations. His voice cracked as he pointed at her, his hand trembling so badly it looked like he could barely keep it steady. "You're fired," he said, choking on the words. Then louder, almost shouting this time, "All of you, pack your desks. Now." Silence. The kind of silence that cuts deeper than any scream. A fork clinked against a plate, and then stopped. Passengers froze mid-breath. Even Linda, who only minutes ago was smirking at Malcolm, now stood stiff, her lips parting but no sound coming out. She finally managed to stammer. "Excuse me." Her voice cracked like glass. She glanced at Malcolm, then back at Peterson, trying to laugh it off. "Because I asked him to wait?" The words echoed through the lounge, bouncing off marble and glass. Passengers gasped. Some looked at Malcolm, others at Linda, but everyone understood. This wasn't about a simple misunderstanding anymore. Something bigger was at play. Peterson didn't laugh. His hands kept trembling as if his body couldn't match the authority of his title. He looked sick, desperate, cornered. He didn't even acknowledge Malcolm's presence, because acknowledging him would mean confronting the truth of why he was really there. Linda's smirk collapsed into panic. Her eyes darted to the other staff, searching for support. But her colleagues had already stepped back, shrinking into the background like shadows. No one wanted to be associated with her now. Not when a vice president was spitting out the word fired like it was poison. Passengers started whispering, their voices rising in little waves of shock. Did he just say fired? All of them. What's going on? Phones slid out of pockets, screens lighting up as some began to record. What had started as humiliation for Malcolm had transformed into a spectacle no one wanted to miss. Linda tried again, her tone sharper now but thinner too. "Mr. Peterson, there must be some mistake." But he cut her off, voice breaking under pressure. "There's no mistake. Effective immediately. You're done. Every single one of you." The words landed heavy, final. And yet, the strangest part remained. Peterson's refusal to even glance at Malcolm. He wasn't protecting him, wasn't apologizing, wasn't offering corporate spin about customer experience or operational necessity. He was terrified. Terrified of the man standing silently by the window in a navy blue suit. That silence made the tension unbearable. Who was Malcolm, really? Why did the vice president of an airline look more afraid of him than of the scandal unfolding in front of dozens of witnesses? The entire lounge waited for Malcolm to move, to speak, to claim the victory that had just dropped into his lap. But he didn't. He stood perfectly still, eyes steady, letting the silence do the talking. And then, just as Peterson turned his back on Linda, his lips moved, not toward her, not toward the passengers, but toward someone only he could see. His whisper was faint, almost trembling. "God help us, he's here." The room froze again. Peterson's words weren't meant for Malcolm, but everyone heard them. And suddenly, the real question wasn't why Linda had been fired. It was why a vice president was so afraid of one silent man in a navy suit. Linda's voice cracked like glass under pressure. Her polished confidence had vanished, and all that remained was desperation. "Because I asked him to wait," she stammered, her eyes wide, darting from the trembling vice president to the calm figure of Malcolm Carter. For the first time that night, the mask of authority she wore so proudly slipped away, exposing the fear underneath. Her question wasn't just about her job. It was about dignity, about being publicly stripped of the power she thought was hers to wield. In that lounge filled with polished shoes, tailored suits, and carefully managed expressions, the air turned sharp. Guests who moments before sipped champagne with casual indifference now leaned forward, their curiosity blazing. The humiliation Malcolm had carried in silence was now bouncing back in Linda's direction, amplified, impossible to hide. But Peterson, the vice president, didn't answer her. He didn't even glance her way. His eyes were fixed downward, on the floor, as if staring at her might burn him. His hands trembled at his sides, his jaw clenched so tightly you could see the muscle twitch. This was not the face of a man enforcing operational necessity. This was the face of a man who had just realized the cost of a fatal mistake. Passengers whispered, their voices cutting through the silence like tiny blades. "Wait, she's being fired for that," someone muttered. Another voice hissed back, "No, something's off. Look at him, look at the VP. He's terrified." Phones glowed quietly in the background as some began recording, capturing every word, every flicker of expression. In an age where reputations lived and died online, this moment was already halfway to going viral. Linda, still clinging to the last fragments of authority, jabbed her finger toward Malcolm. "Because I told him to wait outside?" Her voice rose, louder, sharper, shaking with both fear and rage. "He's just a passenger. What gives him?" She stopped, or maybe the words died in her throat. Because when she looked at Malcolm again, he wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even blinking. He just sat there, perfectly calm, his navy blue suit catching the glow of the lounge lights like armor. His silence cut deeper than any shout could. It was the kind of silence that said, "I don't need to explain myself. The truth will explain me." And that silence worked its way into the room. Even the clinking glasses stilled. Everyone could feel it. The balance of power had shifted. The woman who once thought she was gatekeeping an elite space now looked like an intruder in her own kingdom. But here's the part no one could make sense of. Peterson's fear wasn't directed at Linda. It was directed at Malcolm. His eyes, when they finally lifted, darted nervously toward the man sitting still as stone. And in that fleeting glance was a secret so heavy it bent the air around them. Why was the airline's vice president, the man who held careers in his palm, looking at one passenger as if he'd just seen his own downfall? The room was still asking the same question when Malcolm finally adjusted his cufflink, a tiny, deliberate movement that carried the weight of inevitability. He hadn't spoken a word, And yet, everyone knew the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. What exactly did Peterson know about Malcolm Carter? And why did that knowledge make him tremble like a guilty man caught in the act? Peterson stood frozen, sweat dripping down his temple, his lips moving as if words wanted to escape but dared not. The crowd expected him to scold Linda, maybe explain her dismissal. Instead, his gaze kept circling back to Malcolm Carter, like a man staring at the sun too long, painful, unavoidable. You could feel in the air. This wasn't just corporate discipline. This was fear. The irony cut deep. Only minutes ago, Linda had smirked, certain she had the power to decide who belonged. But now, the vice president of North American operations couldn't even look Malcolm in the eye without flinching. The entire lounge saw it. The hierarchy had flipped. Those who once carried superiority in their posture now shifted uneasily, realizing their experience of discretion had been shattered. Passengers whispered again, their voices heavier than before. "Why is he so scared of him?" one asked, almost trembling. "He's just a guy in a suit." But that word just hung in the air, dissolving fast. Everyone in that room felt it. Malcolm wasn't just anything. Malcolm sat perfectly still, not uttering a single word. He didn't gloat. He didn't rush to defend himself. He didn't lean forward or raise an eyebrow. Silence became his shield, and that silence was louder than Peterson's trembling breath. Imagine being so powerful that you never need to argue. Imagine being so dangerous that someone else's fear exposes everything before you even move. And Peterson's fear was unmistakable. He rubbed his hands together, not out of cold, but out of nervous habit. He tried to stand tall, but his shoulders sagged like a man waiting for judgment. He wasn't protecting the airline. He was protecting himself, because deep down, he knew what everyone else didn't. Malcolm Carter had the kind of power you never want to turn against you. What haunted Peterson's eyes wasn't respect, wasn't guilt, it was survival. A desperate attempt to manage what couldn't be managed. A man who suddenly realized the entire operational necessity he'd been hiding behind had collapsed in seconds. And now, every second Malcolm stayed, silence stretched like a blade at his throat. The room felt it too. People began to shift in their seats, some leaning forward with their phones ready, others glancing nervously at the doors as if expecting something, anything, to break this unbearable tension. But Malcolm only adjusted his tie, smooth and steady, like he was preparing for something bigger than this small humiliation. He didn't need to answer Linda's desperate question. He didn't need to ask Peterson why his hands shook. The truth was already written across the man's pale face. Still, one question hung over the lounge, impossible to ignore. What did Peterson know that the rest of them didn't? And then it happened. Peterson's lips parted, his voice a whisper barely above breath, meant for no one but himself. Yet the room was so silent, everyone heard it. He wasn't supposed to be here. The words hit like a thunderclap. Passengers gasped. Linda's eyes widened. And for the first time, Malcolm's expression shifted. Not with anger, not with relief, but with something colder. A calm so sharp it cut through the tension like glass. What exactly did Peterson mean? And why would Malcolm Carter's very presence in that lounge terrify the man who ran it? For the passengers in the lounge, it still looked like a bizarre overreaction. A manager fired, an entire staff dismissed, and a vice president shaking like a leaf in front of a man who hadn't spoken a single word. To them, it was corporate chaos. But beneath the polished marble and the champagne glasses, another story was unfolding, one they could never imagine. Because Malcolm Carter was not who they thought he was. The navy blue suit, the polished shoes, the reputation of a successful CEO, that was the surface. Behind that surface lived something far more dangerous. His company, the one people read about in glossy magazines, wasn't built only on boardrooms and business plans. It was built as a cover, a shield, a mask. For months, Malcolm had been working with federal agents, weaving his way into the hidden corners of elite travel where money, privilege, and power moved unchecked. Not to chase profit, not to secure another deal, but to hunt. to hunt the network that had been smuggling contraband through the very spaces where prejudice thrived behind a smile and a uniform. And where better to hide a smuggling ring than in the Airline Sky Lounge? The one place designed to be untouchable, where discretion was not just a courtesy, but a selling point. No questions asked, no random searches, just the promise of exclusivity, wrapped in leather seats and expensive wine. Malcolm knew the game. He knew racism worked like camouflage here, because no one would ever suspect the people in charge, the ones who believed they belonged. And Linda? She was just a face on the front line, carrying out rules she thought were about standards and operational necessity. What she didn't realize was that those rules had been twisted to protect something much darker. When she told Malcolm to wait outside, she thought she was humiliating a man who didn't belong. What she was really doing was stepping in front of the very person sent to shut it all down. That 5-word text Malcolm typed, it wasn't a complaint. It wasn't a plea. It was a signal. A signal to the team already watching from the shadows, already listening, already prepared. Peterson knew. That's why his face turned pale the second he walked in. Because Malcolm wasn't just a first-class passenger. He wasn't just a CEO. He was the kill switch. The quiet figure planted exactly where the operation was weakest. And the humiliation Linda thought would break him, it only confirmed what he had come to expose. Imagine sitting in that lounge, sipping your drink, and realizing the man you just saw disrespected was carrying the kind of authority that could end careers, close down departments, and drag a billion-dollar brand into scandal overnight. That's what Peterson saw when he looked at Malcolm. Not dignity alone, but danger. The kind of danger that comes when power is hidden in plain sight. And here's the part that stung the most. Malcolm never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Racism had already done the work for him. It made them reveal themselves. It made them arrogant enough to think they were safe. And in that arrogance, they showed their hand to the one man they could never afford to offend. Passengers whispered nervously, unaware of how close they were to history being made in real time. Phones captured fragments, but no lens could show the full truth. The truth was this. The investigation wasn't just beginning. It was ending. And the lounge, with its velvet ropes and silent stairs, was about to collapse from the inside. Because Malcolm Carter had come to JFK with more than a meeting on his calendar. He had come with a mission. And in 5 quiet minutes, that mission was already locked in motion. What none of the passengers knew, what even Linda hadn't realized, was that Malcolm's text had already unleashed the next phase. And the first agents were moving toward the lounge doors right now. That text, just 5 quiet words, wasn't customer service. It wasn't a complaint form lost in some digital inbox. It was a key, a switch, the kind of message that doesn't ask for help but unleashes something already prepared. For 5 minutes, everyone thought Malcolm was powerless. Linda smirked. The staff stood taller, their silence agreeing with her. Even some passengers leaned into the performance, convinced the black man in the navy blue suit was out of place. But what they didn't know was that those 5 minutes weren't wasted time. They were countdown time, because the text had gone exactly where it was meant to go. Not to a call center, not to a friend, but to an encrypted channel tied into a months-long operation. The moment his thumb hit send, the lounge wasn't just a lounge anymore. It was a crime scene waiting to be unwrapped. Federal agents had been circling JFK for weeks, watching patterns, following shipments, tracing money that slipped through elite discretion. They knew contraband was moving under the cover of private jets. They suspected the Airline Sky Lounge was the gate. What they needed was a trigger, a confirmation, something undeniable. Malcolm Carter was that trigger. His presence was the test. Linda failed it instantly. The staff confirmed it with their silence. And when Peterson burst through the doors pale and trembling, it wasn't because of one angry message. It was because he knew exactly what that signal meant. Operational necessity, that phrase corporate leaders love to throw around, took on a darker meaning now. Because every face behind that counter wasn't just an employee. They were now liabilities. Risks to the airline, risks to the operation, risks to Peterson himself. Linda thought she was protecting the lounge's standards. What she really did was trip the wire that revealed the corruption built into its walls. Imagine being in that room when the truth clicked. The hum of conversation dying down. Phones recording from the corners. People whispering not about drinks or boarding times, but about the trembling vice president who couldn't look Malcolm in the eye. Every second stretched, and in those seconds, the entire management structure of the lounge collapsed in silence. Malcolm didn't raise his head. He didn't wave his phone around. He didn't even glance at Linda. He simply sat there, calm as the marble floor beneath him, as if he had known all along how this moment would unfold. Because he did. That was the difference. Linda believed she was in control. Peterson thought he was managing damage. But Malcolm had been holding the real control since the moment he walked in. The kill switch wasn't about anger. It wasn't about revenge. It was about inevitability. The text turned their arrogance into evidence. It turned one public humiliation into the final proof needed to shut everything down. And as the silence stretched, as passengers shifted in their seats and staff whispered to each other with panic in their eyes, the next move was already in play. Because 5 words had set the plan in motion. And even as Peterson tried to mask his fear, the sound of heavy footsteps was already echoing down the hall toward the lounge doors. When those doors opened again, it wouldn't be another executive. It would be the people Linda and her crew feared most, agents ready to drag their experience of discretion into the light. The doors didn't creak open this time. They burst. Black vests, plain clothes, and quiet radios filled the Aerolux Sky Lounge in seconds. The atmosphere shifted from polished exclusivity to something closer to a crime scene. Nobody expected federal agents to storm a space reserved for the wealthy. Nobody expected the marble-and-glass sanctuary of power to turn into a holding pen. Passengers froze with half-sipped coffee, luxury watches glinting under the lights, phones halfway to their ears. Some tried to look away, pretending not to notice, but curiosity always wins. One by one, phones came out, cameras tilted discreetly, because this wasn't just travel anymore. This was history in motion. The staff behind the counter, Linda and her team, snapped out of their smugness. They traded nervous glances, whispering fragments of questions that went nowhere. But the agents already knew their names. They moved with precision, calling each one out like players in a lineup. The same voices that had dismissed Malcolm minutes earlier now trembled, stuttering excuses, hands clutching at aprons and name badges. And Malcolm? He didn't move. He sat in the same chair, his phone resting calmly on the table, his navy suit crisp under the lounge's soft lighting. He didn't need to stand. His stillness said everything. The humiliation shifted like a tide. 5 minutes ago, it had been Malcolm who stood outside the velvet rope, eyes on him, whispers behind his back. Now it was Linda, pulled aside, wrists shaking, cheeks flushed, who felt the sting of being judged in public. And unlike him, she wasn't being asked to step outside. She was being escorted out for good. Passengers whispered louder now, no longer bothering to hide their reactions. What's happening? Are they really staff? Smuggling? Here. Rumors spread before facts could catch up. The cameras stayed up, documenting every second, because everyone knew a scandal born in Terminal 4 was about to go viral. One passenger, an older businessman in a tailored gray suit, leaned forward and whispered to his companion, "I thought they were just being strict." "I didn't think." His voice trailed off, as though the truth itself was too heavy to finish. That's how racism often hides, in policies, in tone, in so-called discretion, until it cracks wide open under the weight of exposure. The agents moved quickly. Each staff member marched out past the very passengers they had once looked down on. Linda tried to resist the narrative, her voice cracking in desperation. "This is a mistake. I was only doing my job." "You can't." But no one in authority even turned her way. She was invisible now, not powerful, not in control. The cruel symmetry was impossible to miss. The woman who had humiliated a first-class passenger in public was now humiliated in the same space, with 10 times the audience. Except this time, the stakes weren't about ego. They were about crime, exposure, and the end of a career. And Malcolm? Still silent. No smirk, no victory speech, just the calm presence of someone who knew exactly how this moment would unfold. That silence was more cutting than words. It was the silence of a man who didn't need to prove his worth, because the truth had done it for him. But here's what no one in that lounge could shake: the nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't coincidence. The timing was too sharp, the reversal too perfect. A 5-word text, 5 minutes of waiting, and now an empire of arrogance collapsing in real time. The Aerolux Sky Lounge was no longer a temple of luxury. The marble floor, once polished to reflect wealth and discretion, was now scuffed by boots, radios crackling as agents moved through the space like hunters cleaning out a nest. The scent of fresh espresso still lingered in the air, but it mixed now with the sharp sting of fear and shame. Every passenger could feel it, the collapse of an image carefully built on exclusivity. And in the middle of it all sat Malcolm Carter, silent, unmoved. He didn't argue. He didn't gloat. He didn't even raise an eyebrow. His calmness was its own kind of power, a language louder than shouts, sharper than any speech. Because in a room where everyone else scrambled for excuses, he was the only one who didn't need to explain himself. Linda's voice cracked again, desperate, almost shrill. "You can't just fire us like this. It's not fair." Her protest echoed against the high glass windows, but nobody answered. Even Peterson, the vice president who had stormed in trembling minutes earlier, kept his eyes low, sweat still running down his forehead. Fairness was a word that suddenly had no weight. Passengers shifted in their seats, the atmosphere charged with an awkward truth. They had witnessed the small humiliation earlier when Malcolm had been told to wait outside. Many of them said nothing then. They had looked down at their phones, sipped their coffee, pretended not to hear. But now those same passengers watched Linda and her team stripped of their dignity in real time. The contrast was impossible to miss. Racism had blinded them. It had blinded Linda from recognizing who Malcolm was. It had blinded the room in his silence when prejudice paraded itself as policy. And now, that blindness looked foolish under the cold light of consequence. The very people who thought they held authority, who believed they had the discretion to decide who belonged and who didn't, were revealed as powerless. Malcolm remained quiet because silence was the sharpest form of justice here. He didn't need to remind anyone of his ticket, his status, or his success. He didn't need to correct the smirks or challenge the whispers. Every detail of the reversal already spoke for him. His restraint, his refusal to gloat, cut deeper than revenge ever could. It showed that power isn't about volume, it's about control. And yet, his silence also forced the room to confront something uncomfortable: the fact that dignity is never guaranteed, not even by wealth. A navy blue suit, a first-class ticket, a successful company. None of it had shielded him from suspicion when Linda wrinkled her nose. 4 black travelers. Even in elite spaces, respect can be revoked in an instant. One man near the bar finally muttered under his breath, not to Malcolm, but to himself, if he hadn't kept calm, none of this would have happened. His words carried a twisted truth. Malcolm's refusal to explode, to meet insult with outrage, had given him the space to reveal the deeper rot beneath the surface. Had he shouted, the story might have ended with him dragged out by security instead of Linda being marched out by agents. His composure was the kill switch. The poetic justice was thick in the air. The lounge that once prided itself on experience and operational necessity was now a stage for exposure. Staff who had weaponized those very words against a black man were reduced to whispers, escorted out in front of strangers with phones recording every second. Discretion, the thing this space claimed to uphold, was gone. The humiliation was public, permanent, unforgettable. And Malcolm? Still silent. But silence doesn't erase questions. Silence doesn't erase fear. The passengers noticed Peterson stealing glances at him, noticed the way the vice president's hands trembled even after the firings were done. Something about Malcolm terrified him, not because of who he was as a passenger, but because of who he was beyond the suit, beyond the title. That was the part no one could name. Not yet. They only knew that this wasn't just poetic justice. It was something heavier, something hidden, and it wasn't over. That was the lasting truth of that afternoon. The very people who thought they had control were left powerless, while the man they tried to dismiss held all the dignity in the room. And as the agents led the disgraced staff away, every witness understood they had seen more than just firings. They had seen justice, quiet but undeniable. The story didn't end with cheers or applause. It ended with silence, the kind that lingers, the kind that demands reflection. A silence that followed Malcolm as he sat steady in his chair, as if waiting for the world itself to catch up with what had just been revealed. The lounge was quiet now, quieter than it had been in years. The same marble floors that once echoed with the shuffle of privilege now carried the heavy footsteps of shame. One by one, the staff who had sneered, smirked, or stood by in silence were led away. Their polished uniforms looked less like status and more like disguises stripped bare. Passengers who had witnessed the spectacle whispered among themselves, some avoiding Malcolm's gaze, others stealing quick glances as if seeing him for the first time. And there he sat, still in that navy blue suit, still calm, still silent. He had not raised his voice once. He hadn't needed to. His presence alone had shifted the ground under their feet. What they thought was a routine act of exclusion turned out to be the spark that exposed an entire operation. And that's the irony. Racism blinded them so completely, they couldn't see the man who held their fate in his hand. Think about that for a moment. A black man in a first-class lounge, ticket in hand, credentials in order, and still his existence was treated as a mistake. Not because of policy, not because of operational necessity, but because, in her mind, discretion meant exclusion. In her mind, experience meant entitlement. In her mind, random was just another excuse to humiliate someone she thought didn't belong. But what Linda, and all those watching, never understood was this. Racism isn't just about hurt feelings. It can be dangerous. It can cost jobs. It can dismantle lives. And sometimes, it can collapse an entire system when it runs headfirst into someone who refuses to bow. Malcolm's restraint was its own lesson. He didn't clap back with insults. He didn't demand an apology. He simply allowed the truth to unfold. That's the kind of dignity that shakes people to their core, because it exposes how small and shallow prejudice really is when faced with quiet, unshakable power. Now here's where I turn to you. Imagine you were in that lounge. Would you have spoken up when you heard Linda's voice rise above the crowd? Or would you have stayed silent, letting the humiliation pass like background noise? Some passengers whispered about the unfairness, but none stepped forward. And isn't that the real scandal? Not just the racism itself, but the silence of those who see it and say nothing. How many times have we all witnessed something wrong and convinced ourselves it wasn't our place to interfere? And here's another question. Do you think Malcolm's money, his status, his sharp suit should have been enough to shield him? Or does racism cut so deep that even success can't protect black dignity? It's easy to believe that power changes everything. But the truth is, racism doesn't care about bank accounts or titles. What Malcolm faced in that moment wasn't about wealth. It was about perception. And perception, poisoned by prejudice, can strip any person of humanity in the blink of an eye. So ask yourself, if Malcolm had been an ordinary man, without the hidden connections, without the authority to send that 5-word text, would the outcome have been different? Would Linda still be standing behind that counter, smiling her cold smile, never held accountable? This is why these stories must be told. Because every incident like this is not just one man's humiliation. It's a mirror held up to society. A mirror that shows us how fragile dignity is when racism decides it doesn't belong. And that's where you come in. Comment justice if you believe Malcolm deserved far better treatment. Tell me in the comments, was this racism or just abuse of power? Let's see what the community thinks. Because silence keeps these stories hidden, and silence lets prejudice survive. Sharing them, discussing them, refusing to look away, that's how change starts. So if this happened in your town, wouldn't you want to know? Don't be blindsided next time. Subscribe. If you believe these stories deserve light, then share this video. Don't let them fade into whispers. At the end of the day, this wasn't just about a lounge in Terminal 4. It wasn't just about a cold smile or a loud dismissal. It was about the hidden power of dignity, the kind that moves quietly, the kind that topples systems built on arrogance and bias. Remember this: prejudice is always watching, waiting for its moment to strike. But so is justice. And sometimes justice looks like a man in a navy blue suit, sitting quietly, sending a text that changes everything. So I leave you with one haunting question. When racism shows up in your presence, will you be the silence or the storm?